Welcome to FP&A Fast Track, your source for FP&A resources to put your career on the fast track. Welcome, everyone. I have a great guest with me today. We met, I think, a couple of years ago, but haven't stayed in as close touch as I wish we would have, especially since I did a little bit of updating on getting up current with what you've been doing. And man, you've been doing a ton of stuff. Let me give you a quick intro here. So Terrell Turner is a CPA who wants to make accounting and finance more useful, which I think is a great intro. And I don't know if you're familiar with this quote, but this British statistician, George Box, once said a long time ago, all models are wrong, but some are useful. And I really liked that when I first heard it, because we have a lot of models and frameworks in accounting and finance, and they're not all factually exactly correct, but a lot of them are useful. So there's so much in your background that I'd love to dive into, but you tell me in the audience, how do you describe yourself, what you do, and who you serve?
Yeah, so definitely. I mean, my background is accounting and finance. So I definitely come at business life from a person who grew up in that discipline of accounting and finance. And so the way I describe myself is we make accounting, finance, and numbers a lot less complicated and just more relevant to the decisions that you need to make, whether that's in your business and occasionally I'll do some conversations where I talk about how to make those numbers relevant just in your life outside of business as well.
Yeah.
Right now, our target audience are law firm and law firm owners, where we work a lot with. And when I'm doing a lot of speaking and traveling, I'm speaking a lot to accounting societies or accounting firm owners or those in the accounting and finance profession.
So I'm curious, how did you get into that niche with attorneys?
Yeah, probably like most people, when I started the firm, you work with whoever will pay you. That's you were
Yes.
going to work with. And after doing that for some time, you realize, hey, this is not a good long-term strategy. And so I had done some consulting with a couple of law firms, and I realized I understand their business. Like their business structure and approach is not very different from an accounting firm. So I know that. Plus, I know the numbers and they needed help. And there weren't a lot of people that I was coming across that were willing to really put it out there as like, hey, we help law firms. And so I said, you know what? If I have limited resources, where do I want to focus it? And it was a great niche to really focus on.
So I saw in one of your posts, you recently got on one of the committees for the Bar Association, right? Which tell me a little bit about that, because that to me speaks to you're not like sticking your toe in this, right? Like you guys are in the deep end of the pool serving attorneys.
Yeah, so we are deep in with attorneys because maybe about 2 years ago, I was asked to be a guest on a podcast, and it was a lawyer and an attorney had a podcast, and I, shared my perspective and some of the things that I was seeing, and she was like, "You know what? You should probably join like the American Bar Association." Now, at the time, I was just like, "What is that?" And she explained it, and I was like, "Oh, it's like the AICPA for lawyers." I was like, oh, "Okay, all right."
Good
And she told me
explanation.
about the law practice division. She was like, "'Cause they need some help creating finance content for law firms." And so I was like, "Okay, yeah, I'll help where I can." I signed up, became a member, and said, "Hey, wherever I can help, just let me know." And I helped for about a year, and they were just like, "Hey, the ideas you've been bringing forward are like amazing. We want to nominate you to be the chair of the law firm finance committee." And I was like, "Okay, I'll do it. I'll help where I can."
That's awesome, dude. That's awesome. So my brother is an attorney and CPA, and he was a CPA first and then got into law because he worked for Deloitte back in the day, back when they were Deloitte Touche before, well, actually, no, they were DHS. I guess they were Deloitte Touche. But anyway, he worked in the financial services division. And I think he realized that he liked the finance part of things even more than the accounting side of things. And so when he went back and went to law school, he specialized in mergers and acquisitions. So that's what he's been doing for 30 years. And the hours are not the greatest, but he loves the work. He's worked on some huge deals and like really complicated transactions. I used to work at M&A back in the day on the finance side of things. I've always found finance much more interesting than accounting, even though I have an accounting degree myself as well. So I like to give the audience a little bit of context, not just on you as the CPA and what you do now, but from the personal side. I know you do a lot of posts on your social media on the personal side. I know you and your wife do posts together and you let people see a little bit behind the scenes who you are as a person. I'm curious, when you were in high school, like when I think back to high school, I had not even the slightest idea of what I wanted to do in college. I was like an ROTC nerd. I ran cross country. I swam. I did all the non cool sports. Who were you in high school? What was your thing in high school?
Yeah, so in high school, I had 3 older brothers. One of them played football, and I got into football at an early age, just watching one of my older brothers, and I also played soccer. So I started playing soccer when I was, like, maybe 6. So I played soccer and football all the way up through age 18, and so for me, at one point, I would say probably around the up until maybe the ninth grade, I just wanted to get good enough grades so my parents would let me play football and soccer. That was what my focus was. It's
Gotcha.
just to keep my parents off my back and just do good enough so I could stay on the team. And it wasn't until maybe around 10th grade where my school was testing out this new program called the Academy of Finance, where they were going to offer some very basic accounting kind of finance classes for high school students. I took it and I was just like, "Okay, I like this." And from that
Interesting.
point on, like, my perspective about school, because I had no real intentions of going to college until maybe, like, halfway through my 10th grade year, where I was like, "Maybe I do wanna go to college." And so what do I need to do to actually go to college? And they were like, "Well, you need to take the SAT, you need to get your GPA up." And from that point on, I was just like, "All right, I'm gonna play sports and I'm gonna do this college thing after I graduate from high school."
So it sounds like at that time, though, the spark was really more on the finance side. Is that right?
Yeah,
Or was it kind of
definitely.
both?
It was a little bit of the accounting really helped out with just teaching basic bookkeeping. And at the time, this was before like accounting softwares and stuff like that. So you were learning the very basic concept, balancing a checkbook, or sometimes we would do some stuff in green ledger paper. Now that stuff was tedious. And I'm like, I really don't like the detail of this, but I like the end result of what we're able to do with this. And we did this we did this joint program with a firm out of New York that flew part of the team or the students in, and we did like a day in the life of finance. They toured the Wall Street and really looked at different things like that to where I was just like, "Hey, this is very different than the option that I was thinking, which was either go to the military or try to find a job right out of high school." I'm like, this could be a better option for me. And so from that point on, I was just like, okay, all right, how do I get into this world of business and using this accounting and finance knowledge that I'm getting exposed to?
Interesting. So if I recall correctly, you posted a picture of your dad when he was in the military. Was your dad in the army?
Yeah, my dad was
Yeah, same.
served in the army for 21 years.
So you were an army brat like me. My dad was in for 30 years, and yeah, different. I think back in the day when I'm a little older than you, obviously, but I think even still, our parents' era in the military, it was a little bit different in that I thought a lot of people, everybody thought I was going to go into the military because most of the men in my family had served. My dad never talked about it. Did your dad ever talk about his experience in the military?
So my dad didn't talk too much about it. Now, I would say, we grew up in that environment, like living on the military base when I was younger. We lived in Germany for about 3.5 years, and it was during the time of Desert Storm. And I would say is after my father was a medic in the army. So after my father came back from Desert Storm, he really didn't talk much about his job in the military. And it's probably because of some of the stuff that he saw being a
Yeah.
medic and actually being in a war zone. And that probably led him to be a little bit more quiet. And we really didn't start talking much about it until maybe after I got married. So my late 20s, like he and I would be out somewhere and he would start telling me a story about something that happened in the military or about his career and stuff like that. So yeah, I didn't really hear that much about it until maybe like my late 20s.
Yeah. I'm guessing it was the same logic with my dad. So he was a medic for part of the time he was in and infantry. And I imagine saw a lot of stuff that just didn't sound like it was stories you wanted to talk about at home.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can definitely relate to the moving around too. But I feel like I'm curious if you would agree with this. I feel as a kid, I didn't like the constant moving, but as an adult, I feel like it really equipped me to be much more adaptable and be able to like make friends with anybody quickly. Does that
Oh,
resonate with you?
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. It was tough trying to navigate that moving around when you're the newer kid or you show up to school and everybody's gone to elementary school together, or hey, they've known each other since kindergarten and you're the newer kid around and your friendships don't go as deep, but eventually you learn how to establish some meaningful relationships. And I think it's really helped me, especially now in running a business or even before I started the business, just developing my finance and accounting career of being able to establish meaningful connections with people in a short amount of time.
Yeah. That's huge. That's huge. I think people, if they've not been in situations where they've seen it, the impact of it, I think a lot of people just don't realize how powerful that is.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
so speaking of that accidentally, but segues into one of the questions I wanted to ask you, which is I talk a lot about communication skills in the work that I do, and I with both accounting and finance folks. So I'm curious, how would you describe people's awareness of today's tech tools and how that compares with the awareness that people seem to have had, say, maybe 5 or 10 years ago?
Yeah, this is always an interesting one because I was talking with someone recently about this. And the way I would say is, I think if it comes down to the surface level of being aware of technology, I would say on a scale 1 to 10, I would put it at probably about a 7. But when I think about really being aware of the use case and the depth of it, I would probably put it somewhere around a 4. And the way I explained it to someone, I was like, it's with George Washington Carver. He made 300 products out of a peanut. And it's archaeology says that peanuts had probably been around for thousands of years. We have been aware of them. But it wasn't until late 1800s that this guy got a really in-depth use on how do we actually use a peanut. Like he was really aware of it. And I think we're like that when it comes down to technology. It's like we know it exists, but really being aware of it to harness the power of it in our day to day and in our lives, I think we're barely scratching the surface.
Yeah, as you were describing that, the thing that jumped out to me is AI and how people who they have an awareness of it, and so you hear them talk about it, and you can tell within like a minute or two whether there's someone that's actually tried to use it versus just someone who's read about it, because they'll talk about what they hear it can do. And I know you talked about this earlier that you use it daily in your business, and I use it as well. And I think you probably saw very quickly, like I did, that it's not exactly what people say that it is when they're doing the marketing spiel on it. It's super useful and helpful. The key is understanding what it's good at, what it's not good at, and then how, exactly to your point about the use case. How do I, now that I understand the pros and cons, how do I then go ahead and use that to its fullest to help me without getting into the downsides of some of the folks I see on LinkedIn and elsewhere that do the like copy paste of something from an AI tool, and you're laughing because you've seen it too. You can tell immediately. It's totally.
It's one of those things I always tell people is that at the state that technology is now, especially when it comes down to AI, is still in its elementary stage or its immature stage to where it is not mature enough to just replace everything that you would do. Right now, it's at that stage where it can be a really good assistance or it can help you get your first draft, and then you still need to play a role in editing, tweaking. And I always tell people is that, and I learned that for myself, is that we use it in different areas of our business. And I'm like, sometimes the hardest thing to do is to come up with that initial draft because it's a
Yeah,
lot easier to edit and tweak things as opposed to starting with a blank canvas. And I'm like,
yeah,
AI is at that point where it can give you an ugly first draft. And that's great because then all you need to do is tweak it a little bit and you can evolve it and massage it where you need to make it more useful for the audience or the situation you're trying to use it for. Because I see a lot of people who are just trying to use it like it's this magic cure for everything. And those are the
Yep.
people that you're just like, I can tell
Yeah.
AI did this and it's totally irrelevant.
Yeah, they shoot themselves in the foot by not being aware. Yeah, and actually that last question that I asked you, the AI is what made me think about that because I was talking to someone the other day and I realized 5 or 10 years ago, when I would get emails from software vendors, for example, just one example, there's lots of categories of this, but software vendors is an easy one, right? They're always sending you these emails talking about, look, new features, new tools in XYZ tool, whatever this thing is. And I used to ignore those all the time because most of the time they were just trying to stay in front of you that whatever feature that they were talking about wasn't really that new. They were just trying to keep something in front of you. And now I feel like if I ignore something from any of the tools that I use that's like an update or a new feature, and that's really to my detriment because they're legitimately coming out with new features and upgrades and updates that are significant, sometimes like weekly, where there's a new feature where you're going, "Holy crap, I was just talking to a friend the other day, I wish it did this, boom, here it is." And
Mhm.
5, 10 years ago, I would have ignored that, but we almost can't do that anymore because things are moving so quickly. And so one of the things that I've been using AI for, I'm curious to get your thoughts on not just how you've used it yourself in this regard, but how you've seen clients or people that have been in the audience at presentations that you've done in the area of creating and communicating SOP, standard operating procedures. I found that's an area where AI has been very helpful. I'm curious what you've seen out there in your day to day.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it has been very helpful. And I think if you consider how AI works, it's all of this data that it is taking into consideration. So when you ask it a question or you give it a task, it's pulling from all these different places. Now, you don't know exactly where it's pulling the data from, but I think it becomes helpful that it is pulling from a wide array of things because let's say you're trying to create a SOP for an area in your business or your organization that you don't really have direct experience with. You can ask the AI, hey, give me a draft of an SOP for this area or for this topic. And it can give you a pretty decent starting point to where I think it can fill in I could say years of a knowledge gap because for some people before you would have had to go research it on your own, or you would have had to rely on your own legacy experiences from prior jobs or prior experience. Now you can tap into an AI tool that can quickly give you at least, as I would say, a rough, ugly draft of it. So you're no
Yeah.
longer just starting from scratch. And I think when it comes down to SOPs, I spend a lot of time in that area for my own business of really going back and okay, all right, how do we here's what we do. I need some help to say, all right, let me ask the AI, turn this into an SOP. Like, here are the steps that I do, or hey, here's an email of what I want them to do. Let's turn this into a SOP or a step-by-step process that can help communicate that better to the team.
So I know one of the things in your huge repertoire of stuff you do as a CPA speaker, social media influencer is you do a lot of presentations. I know you just did one recently for one of the state societies, and which is why one of the reasons I thought about asking you about the technology question. But as someone who does their fair share of public speaking, what's one piece of advice that you can give people when they present on being more clear when they're presenting?
Yeah, I would say the most important thing that I've learned is to really define who are you talking to. Because a lot of times when I was an immature speaker, I was so focused on my content, what I was gonna say, and my delivery, and you know, was completely ignorant to the fact that, you know what? I'm not making this contextual to the person that I'm actually trying to talk to. And so now what I try to do is whenever I'm gonna speak somewhere is get a little bit of understanding and context about the audience. And especially if I'm doing it virtual, I'll tell people like put in the chat where you're coming from or what you do. If I'm speaking to an organization, hey, what's your job title within the organization? That way I get a better picture of who I'm talking to and
Yep.
then I can make the message a lot more contextual to that audience that I'm trying to talk to. And they tend to walk away being able to take away more practical, more real, more tangible qualities out of what I'm trying to communicate.
Yeah, that's a great point. You just and I swear to you, this was not a setup because I didn't know what your answer was gonna be. But I actually talk a lot about in knowing your audience, like, we have to wear different hats. I know you I'm gonna ask you a question about some of the stuff you do to make it fun. I like to use different things like props. If I'm an FP&A guy, but now I'm going over to talk to an IT guy, I need to put on my IT hat and think like an IT person. Like, how do they come at this issue, whatever this issue is that we're going to be talking about? Because they have a whole different subculture within the organization as compared to FP&A, accounting, whoever it is. They have a whole different set of lingo. They may be more detail oriented, less detail oriented. Like all of these things factor in. And so I've used that as like a physical metaphor because it seems to stick with people more when they actually see it. But that's one that it took me a long time to learn that because what you started saying is exactly what I used to do is I got my notes, I got my slides, I got to stay up. I practiced, I know my stuff. I want to look professional. I've rehearsed, and now I'm like outline. Like I've done this enough, and I know you're at that point where you don't necessarily have to have every word memorized, and you have to have that flexibility to go, "Oh, okay, like 40% of this audience are not CPA, like, in public accounting, right? They're in corporate accounting, right? So
Mhm.
it's a whole different animal. So now maybe the use cases, the scenarios that you use, the examples that you use change so that you can be a little bit more in in tune with that audience." Another question along the same lines of presenting or and actually just presenting actually, because I'm curious your thoughts on this in any type of communication, but what are some of the things, like 2 or 3 things that you do to be more engaging than the typical accounting communicator?
Yeah, definitely. One of the things that I do before pretty much lately before any speech or any presentation that I'm giving is set the groundworks and give people a heads up of what's going to happen. And not so much just, hey, here's my outline, but even just talking them through, hey, we're about to start a conversation because as I say stuff, it's going to spark ideas and you're going to start thinking of solutions that you could do, things that you can implement. And I start preparing them like that's going to happen because no matter what, like whenever I'm sitting down, it could be the greatest speaker in the world. They may say something that sparks my mind running in different directions. And I try to let them know up front, like, that is okay for you to do that. I think that, hey, that's how you're going to get value out of it. And I think once it starts happening, because I can, especially when I'm in person, I can look at the audience. And as I'm making eye contact, I can tell that person's running on a tangent, and which is great because I want them to get what they need out of it. So I think setting that tone and letting them know, hey, it is okay for you not to be hanging on to every word that I say. And then I think really try to find sometimes out of the box examples that can really help illustrate the point because what I do know is the facts and figures, people will forget all about that, but they'll remember the stories. And I think the ways that we can blend in stories, whether that's current events or whether it's something completely different. Like I was giving a talk at a university in North Carolina and it was a CPE, so a room full of CPAs that are trying to get their CPE. And one of the things that I was talking about is just my journey and how I started learning about accounting. And something that sparked for me was like I was watching an episode of DuckTales as a kid, and Scrooge McDuck mentioned about tax deductions. And I'm like, somehow that stayed in my mind all the way up until I was in high school. And in fact, and so many people are like, "Oh my gosh, I love that show DuckTales as a kid," and it allowed them to engage with whatever I was gonna say next a lot more. And then I do think of just encouraging people to really take notes during whatever speech I'm giving because I think sometimes people don't want to feel rude and like looking down or looking away or looking on their phone is I tell people like, "Hey, it is okay for you to take notes. It's okay if
Yeah.
you need to look down at your phone or even if you need to step out, I think giving people that permission to say, "Hey, you don't have to be that tense," because if an audience is tense, they're not gonna remember much of what you shared anyway.
Yeah.
And the best way to learn and remember things is when you're having fun and you're a bit more relaxed. And so I think by doing some of those things that help bring the tension down in the room, I think it really helps the audience walk away with a lot more value.
Yeah, so as you were describing that in the beginning, I thought back on some sales training where they were talking about setting the frame, which is
Mhm.
exactly what you described, right? So you're setting the frame. If you look at sort of old school presentation teachings, they would say, tell them what you're going to tell them and then tell them what you told them. So this is, you're telling them what you're going to tell them, but you're setting up an expectation and a frame around it that's defining it for them, but then you're doing it in a way that's giving them permission to say, okay, I know that's where he's going, but he gave me permission. If I want to ask a question that's out of left field, I feel like I'm okay to ask that too. And then something you said about the taking notes, I try as much as possible, even like now when we're virtual, to let people see that I'm taking notes so that they don't just see this, right? I'm looking down and I'm like, well, what is this guy doing? Is he following? So I'll literally try to bring whatever I'm writing on up into the frame so that you can see that I'm taking notes. And to your point, some people think, isn't that rude? No, that's not rude. If you're taking notes on what I'm talking about, what do you think I'm thinking? I'm thinking, oh, this guy's interested. This
Mhm.
guy's actually engaged in what I'm talking about, and to me, that's what I'm looking for, right? I want that person
Mhm.
to be engaged. So you just touched on something that with the Scrooge McDuck thing. So I saw, and tell me if I'm remembering this correctly, but did you do the Super Mario Brothers post? Was that a challenge from a friend, or was it just a question, or how did that come about? Because it seems like now this has started like a theme now.
It was a video challenge that a friend of mine, she was doing a video challenge about creating a video and do something different. And so I was like, okay, all right, what can I do that's different? And it's like, what if I just take completely left field, what you would normally think is a non-business related topic, and how do I connect the dots? And I really enjoyed Super Mario Brother as a kid. I still like watching the franchise now, and even just some of the video games, and just seeing now as an adult, seeing what it did as a business, and I'm just, like, very fascinated by it. And I created a video. It's probably like a 5-minute video where I talk about the business lessons that we learned from Super Mario. And as I really did that video and people saw it, people connected with it so well to the point where I'm like, "Wow, doing something like this stood out in people's mind to where, like you, people come up to me and say, 'Oh, you did the Super Mario video.'" And I was like, "Okay, if that's what it took for this subject matter or these topics to stick in their mind, like, I'm willing to be a little bit more creative to really help my message get across if this is what it's gonna take to help."
So two things came up for me as you were describing that. One is that inspires me now to try something much more creative. But secondly, for anybody watching or listening to this that thinks the same, that hey, I'm going to try something creative too, go watch his Super Mario Brothers video before you do it, because this dude did not just have an idea and slap something, turn the camera on and start talking. Like I could tell you spent some time on, like you did like you had real legit like business, like you, this was very well researched. I don't want to give too much away because I want people to go watch it, but you could tell this was not just some YouTuber that didn't know anything about business that was trying to connect dots. Like this was clearly someone that understands business to be able to put the information together and connect dots for people that would not ordinarily connect naturally for them, which
Mhm.
I think that's what, for me as an accountant and FP&A guy, that's what made that like next level. So it was cool and it was fun that you did something with Super Mario Brothers, but the fact that it was like super legit in the way it was done from a business perspective, I walked away from that going, man, I got to take my stuff to the next level. So thanks for the inspiration on it because it's not just a good idea if it's not implemented. So props on that.
Well, thank
Oh,
you. I appreciate it, and that's always really good feedback because I will say is for myself, one of the things that I try to do is just be honest is that when it comes down to accounting and finance content, it's not the most interesting stuff that you really want to pay attention to. And I would say is probably once I got into college, that was one of my big frustrations with accounting and finance. And I'm like, I find the usefulness of accounting and finance to be so amazing, but I'm like, the way we deliver it at times can really turn people off. And I've been on this crusade of like, how do I stretch myself as a communicator to be able to take the amazing quality of accounting, finance, FP&A, using technology in those space? Like, how do I stretch myself as a speaker to be able to convey some of that excitement? And right now, I'm just testing some ideas of using everyday examples or using things that are not typically talked about in business, connecting the dots for people to make the subject matter come to life a little bit more.
Yeah, dude, I'm like literally getting ideas as you're talking from because that was how many have you done now since the Super Mario Brothers one? Because I know you've done more
Ah,
since then.
man, it is probably, I would say probably since then, I've done maybe like 30 different ones.
Oh, wow. So how much of your time would you say, just guesstimates here, on a typical day, how much of your time would you say is devoted to creating content?
Yeah, so on a typical day, I probably spend on average about 3 hours a day around content. And a lot of times is I'm doing it in stages where, hey, today is just more of idea stages. I'm coming up with
Brainstorming.
different
Yeah.
ideas. Tomorrow may be like, hey, I'll pick a couple of those ideas. How do I refine it a little bit? Because I'm not a person who can just sit down for just, hey, for the next 8 hours, I'm just gonna focus on that because when getting into the creativity, like sometimes it hits me at different times where I got to jot the idea down. Hey, I'll come back to it later. So I
Yeah.
would say I probably spend about between 2 to 3 hours a day, whether that's working on content or working with my marketing assistant that I have. That's as we're talking through some ideas and she's doing some of the technical editing behind the scenes on things.
So for those of you out there that are looking at the content that him and his wife put out and go, "Oh, I want to do that," realize 2 to 3 hours a day, that's a significant investment, right? For a CPA who has a CPA practice, who does speaking and all this stuff that you have on your plate, to put aside on average 2 to 3 hours a day to put into your social media. I can tell you as someone that I do the podcast and I put stuff out on social media, but nothing at the scale that you guys are doing. So that's good though for me to hear that to go, okay, that's what it takes, man. If you want to get, because you have a significant follower base on LinkedIn. I don't know about all your other platforms, but LinkedIn alone, you have a significant follower base. And how long would you say it's taken you to get where you are from whenever you started ish ballpark?
Yeah, so I would say probably ballpark when I was still working in corporate, let's say what, a little over 3 years ago, we probably were at maybe 4,000 followers and connections on LinkedIn to where now we're somewhere around like 13, 14,000. So it's taken about 3.5 years to get to that point. And a lot of it was just really testing different approaches. And at one point we were like, oh, we just got to get the follower count up. And I think this was another just evolution of being a better communicator, of going back and saying, you know what? I don't want people to just follow me just to follow me. It's who am I actually adding value to? And we said that, hey, we want to actually grow our audience and our community more strategically. And so we really started going back and saying, okay, all right, how do we get more clear about the messaging that we're and what we're doing so that we're actually building a reputation on purpose as opposed to just throwing a bunch of stuff out there. And then you have this mixed up bag of people who some people expect you to be the video game guy one day, or they expect you to be this the next day. And it's just no, we want to build on purpose and build strategically. And it's been great because that I think that strategy is what allowed you to be able to run a business where, hey, our business can keep growing and we can keep serving clients and we can bring you on staff members. And now I'm thinking about how do we make sure that the staff we've hired, that they're on a personal development journey for themselves personally and professionally, and like being a good leader in a business. also serving the clients, and then also growing my own personal brand and the content and stuff. And I think the only way to do that is to have a strategy that has connection between all those points.
Yeah, it's gotta be much more that's something that I'm starting to focus on much more too, is even in preparing for the podcast and pulling out content from the podcast to post on social media, getting more strategic so that the audience consistently sees, hey, this guy's providing value in these specific areas. So that if there's someone that is interested in that, when they come back and there's that next podcast, whether it's a clip or the episode, whatever it is, they're going, hey, this is a new person, maybe a different industry, but I'm still learning on that same topic that I'm interested in, and it's consistent. And I think that's where I know for me personally, I've been all over the place pursuing more of my own interests and trying to then take that and figure out how I can serve it up to the audience in a way that's valuable for them, to being much more intentional with what specific questions am I asking? What specific guests am I having on? And how are we keeping that focus so that the audience is consistently getting value in that same
Mhm.
vein?
Yeah.
Um,
And I think that's something that a lot of people beat themselves up about that journey. And one of the things that I always tell people about just what my path of we went through probably a year, maybe a year and a half of the very first podcast I started was called Business Talk Library, where I was just talking to any type of business. We didn't really have a clear direction other than, hey, I wanted to talk to a lot of people and just learn as much as I could from the perspective. And through that process, we started to really find our lane, like what really resonated as well. And I think a lot of people are a little afraid to test different strategies or test the waters on different things. But I'm like, the only way that I knew to get to finding, hey, what's the lane we want to run in? When we didn't have much of a following, let's just test the waters on things and see
Start
what
running.
resonates well. And when we
Yeah.
found our lane, like that's where things really started to take off with where the community grew, also just with the amount of speaking engagements. And then also even in the business where, clients and revenue that started growing as well. But it required us to have to test some things before we found that lane we wanted to run in.
Yeah. When I first started this podcast, I pondered and pondered planning all this stuff out and trying to figure everything out. The majority of my career, the word planning has been either my job title or the department I worked in. So and everything in a big corporate environment, it's got to be perfect before you launch anything. And I finally bit the bullet. I said, the only way I'm going to be able to do a good podcast is accepting the fact that it's probably going to suck for a while until I learn how to get better. And I just have to do it. And then through hard knocks, I'll figure out what's not very good and what is, and tweak and tweak. And all along the way, if you look at my first episode to this episode, they're big improvements, but there's still I look at it like anything where you look at like perfection being the goal, you're never going to get there, but you're always trying to be better, right? Is how I
Mhm.
look at it. So you talked about that you guys have a team now, and I'm curious, whenever you're starting to build a team, regardless of how big or small that team is, I think one of the things that in my experience at working for big companies where things are very different now in terms of culture is in how empathy is factored into the culture at work. And I'm curious, what are some things in the world of accounting that relate to empathy where you feel like that there's something that is true about how empathy is showing up, but they may seem a little bit contrarian?
Gotcha. Yeah, so a common thing that you hear in accounting is, oh, it's all about the numbers or it's about the math, it's about being black and white. And what I experience is that is not the case at all because I'm just like, the numbers are a small part of what we do in accounting. And especially when you get into FP&A, the numbers are a much smaller part. A lot of it has to do with the strategy, the story you're telling, the audience who's going to receive your information. Like you have to start thinking about and putting yourself in the shoes of so many different people that you're interacting with. And I learned a lot of that working in, corporate finance when I worked for a couple Fortune 500 companies. And one of the big things that it really, really was, I would say, a culture shock at the time is I was in an investor relations role for a company that was about 14 billion in revenue. And we had to make an announcement that a strategy that we had been pursuing, we had spent almost $790 million on it, but that product strategy had to be canceled because it wasn't going to get approved by the EPA.
Well,
And that was like week 1 of my role in investor relations. Like, we need to make this announcement. And so it really taught me that this is not necessarily about the numbers. Like, we need to be prepared for how are the investors going to feel about this message that we need? Because we still need to instill some confidence that, yes, we spent 790 million on this, but we know what we are doing. And here's the path going forward, and how do we keep that confidence and communicate that? And I'm like, less about the numbers and more about understanding people and me putting myself in their shoes as I was trying to help the team write the messaging on how we were going to communicate this. And I think at that point is where it really started making me realize, like, all this stuff we do in accounting and finance is to play a bigger role in the overall strategy, or there's another human being or other human beings on the other side of this reporting, on the other side of this messaging. And I got to do a better job of putting myself in their shoes. So when I'm either putting together this report, or I'm drafting some messaging, or I'm telling this FP&A story, I can think like the audience so I can communicate and deliver a much clearer and authentic message behind what is going on.
yeah, that last part of what you just said, I think is hits the nail on the head with empathy. Because people sometimes confuse empathy for feeling what that other person is feeling. That's sympathy, right?
Mhm.
Empathy to me, especially in a work setting, has more to do with just understanding where the other person is coming from and what their priorities and their problems are. And
Mhm.
it doesn't mean you have to agree with them. It doesn't mean that you have to give them what they want. It doesn't mean that you have to give in. It just means that you understand. And however
Yeah.
that factors into that communication and that relationship, that remains to be seen, right? There's lots of other factors, but it all starts with that empathy of that understanding of where that other
Mhm.
person is coming from. Uh,
Absolutely. Yeah, and I will say, I go back a lot to that my role I did in investor relation, because that taught me that a lot. Because after we made that announcement, the phones were definitely ringing of all the Wall Street analysts who follow us. Some of them saw it coming. Others were, let's just say, the language they used when they called let me know what they were feeling. And just really starting to understand this isn't just about numbers on a page, or numbers in a financial report, or numbers on a spreadsheet. It's like these numbers have an impact on the lives of people. And you need to
yeah.
start understanding who's going to be impacted by this financial or accounting information that you're putting together. And I think, as you said, of being able to understand their perspective, whether I agreed or disagreed, but just starting with, let me understand where they're coming from. So when I am talking about the numbers, or when I'm doing the accounting, I can do it with that in mind.
Yeah, I'm curious. So when I worked at AutoNation, I didn't work in investor relations. I worked in corporate development, but investor relations used my numbers when they talked to Wall Street. So I'm curious if your perspective on it was similar to mine, and that I felt I was stressed all the time, man, because I was producing these spreadsheets and handing them to the VP of Investor Relations, and he'd have me come in and sit in the room while he was on a speakerphone with all these analysts, and they're like, "These are our numbers. How comfortable are you with that?" They're walking through the assumptions, and they're using my numbers. Did you find that to be a stressful job?
I have I will say it was definitely very stressful when I first went into the role, because I really didn't know how to really navigate the stress. But you go through, especially if you go through a few earnings calls, you go through the ringer on the process to where we started, I guess what we called it was the gauntlet of we do an analysis and we would have different people play the role of, all right, your job is to beat the crap out of this model or this
Oh, red
messaging
teaming.
that
Yeah.
and my goal was every question you ask me, I should be able to answer it because at the end of the day, I'm going to hand this messaging and we're going to talk this communication strategy with the CFO and the CEO. I don't want them to get on a call and them to get beat up by questions that we didn't prepare them for. And
Yeah.
so we would do a lot of that kind of role playing and testing. And I think after you get into your rhythm and you find your rhythm there, the stress level went down. Now, I will say it never completely went away. The
Yeah.
stress was always there, but we became better at managing it.
Yeah. I think for me, it was much more frequent than quarterly because I worked at M&A, and the reason they were using my numbers is that I was the one that sort of gathered together all the information on the acquisition. So we're doing a deal, we're buying a dealership or dealership group, and all that data, all the numbers from that, I had to gather together to give them to talk to the street about it. And it was happening all the time, and it was like constantly changing. If you've ever been involved in due diligence is not like something you walk in and you do in an hour and it's done. Sometimes it's a very protracted um, process, and things can pop up all the time, and you go, "Oh, no whammies, right? We're making this announcement to the street," and then you find out something at the last minute, and it's through no fault of anyone's. It's just something that came up in due diligence, and then you just have to figure out on the fly how to deal with that. But that's a great perspective and approach, and I've used that before, and I've even articulated it as thinking of myself as an attorney going into court. And I want to think of what is every possible question that could get thrown at me and be prepared for it and have that ready. Don't throw it all out there. You don't want to spill your beans and open up a can of worms that doesn't need to be open. Keep it in your briefcase, but have it ready and be
Mhm.
prepared. Hopefully a lot of them will never come up, but you at least are a little less stressed and more confident because you're at least prepared for it.
Yeah,
Um,
and I think to your point about empathy too, for me, it was a great development of just understanding that people weren't asking these tough questions because they just disliked me. It's like
yeah,
they were trying to take the information I was giving them and they were trying to make important decisions in their career or important decisions in their life. And I think for me, the stress level started going down some when I started seeing it from their perspective. Okay, all right, they're not asking these questions because they dislike me. It's they're trying to make important decisions. And so
right.
I started having a lot more respect for the tension of that process because I'm like, they're trying to make a yay or nay or whether or not they're going to invest or whether they're going to make a deal or not or whether want to make a different decision. And I think the more that I grew respect for the fact that, hey, this is a dynamic environment. New information can come up at any time. And then also that, hey, people are trying to make really life impacting decisions on the information you're sharing. And the more that I understood that, and like I said, went through the gauntlet a couple times, I think the stress level, it went down some.
Yeah, there's a book that I read. You may have read it as well. Never Split the Difference. Have you read this with Chris
Hmm.
Voss? Just the fact that he operated in an environment where he was working with terrorists all the time, right? People who he had nothing in common with, didn't want to have anything in common with them. It gave me a new perspective on, hey, I used to work in planning where I was in charge of all the analysis for capital projects. So people would constantly be bringing things to me, trying to get money for these capital projects, and they would look at me as the bad guy. It kind of created this us and them dynamic. And reading that book and thinking about his approach to it gave me a new appreciation for looking at it. It doesn't matter who the other person is or what they want. I just have to understand where they're coming from and then figure out how we can work together to get what we both want out of this thing and not be emotional about it, not feel like I have to win or it has to be an us and them, but what's the outcome that each one of us is looking for, and how do we work together to figure something else that works? Because when terrorists have hostages, everything is on the line there, right? And it doesn't matter how you feel. Doesn't matter if you like them, you still have to get the job done.
Yeah.
So we're getting close to the top of the hour. I want to respect your time here. So I wanted to ask a couple of wrap up questions here. And the first one is, out of all the different things that we've talked about, what do you feel like, if there's, and even if we haven't covered it, if there's one or two takeaways for anyone listening to this that you would like them to walk away with from our conversation?
Yeah, I think the first one is don't be afraid to think outside the box when it comes down to communication, whether that is you're communicating financial information or you're doing a speaking engagement about technology or some other topic. It's really allow yourself the freedom and the space to really think outside of the standard framework of it and to really reach for things that will really help the audience because I think for me, that was one of the huge unlocks in my career, which allowed me to move up as I did now in running a business and also helping my team is being willing to think outside the box and focus on what's, valuable for the person that I'm interacting with. And then I would say the second thing, especially when it comes down to communicating in any capacity, is get a clearer picture of who your audience is and invest the time to really understand who are you trying to communicate with. And because the more you get a better picture of who that person is, the more contextual you can make your messaging and your information so that it connects a lot better with the audience that you're trying to impact.
Great point. Figure out what hat they're wearing, right? What hat are they wearing? The tough part is when they're wearing no hat and you don't know where they're coming from. And you got to really dig. You got to really ask questions and get really good at listening because you don't know that much about them. And that's something I'm always trying to get better at. I'm sure as a presenter, as a speaker, and just as a communicator, as a business owner, that's something you're working on all the time as well. So, where is the best place for people to find you?
So I would say on LinkedIn. LinkedIn is probably the best way for people to find me, and it's Terrell A Turner, comma CPA. And there you'll see a lot of the content that we're posting. You'll see a lot of the updates, and then also you'll see me interacting with other content creators that I think are doing some awesome stuff as well.
Awesome. Everybody, check him out on LinkedIn. He's got tons of great content.